Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a truly incredible story. We're looking at how a 13-kilometer island of dense forests and wetlands completely transformed into an undisputed global powerhouse. And spoiler alert, it didn't happen through careful, peaceful planning. As we'll see, it happened through brutal, relentless cycles of devastating destruction, followed by some of the most unprecedented rebirths in human history.
So let's dive right into this fascinating mystery. How exactly does a muddy little trading post at the edge of the map become the capital of the world? Well, when you really look closely at the history, a pretty wild pattern emerges. Every single generation faced a massive existential threat. We're talking catastrophic fires, outright war, total bankruptcy, you name it. But instead of being destroyed, the city somehow took that exact chaos and used it as fuel to grow.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the chaotic foundation. To figure out how this incredible resilience got baked right into the city's DNA, we really have to start at the beginning. This is where the Lenape people's ancient world of Manhattan collided head-on with the Dutch East India Company's total obsession with beaver hats back in the early 1600s. And right out of the gate, New Amsterdam was beautifully chaotic. I mean, Broadway wasn't even a planned road. It actually defies the entire city grid because it was originally a 13,000-year-old Lenape trail. The Dutch literally only showed up because beaver hats were a massive fashion craze back in Europe. And you know that famous story of Peter Minute buying the island for 60 guilders? He actually negotiated with a tribe based over in Brooklyn who didn't even own Manhattan. By 1643, this place was a gloriously unruly settlement of barely 500 people. You had 17 taverns, one single church, and an astonishing 18 different languages echoing through its muddy streets. It was, quite frankly, completely ungovernable. Now that absolute chaos lasted until the arrival of a man with an iron temper and a silver-banded wooden leg. Enter Peter Stuyvesant. His opening quote really says it all. "I shall govern you as a father his children." Yeah, he wasn't there to make friends. He was a tyrant who brought sudden, strict order. He paved the streets, established a weekly market, and built a massive defensive wall on the northern edge of town. But his iron grip alienated the locals so much that when the English sent warships in 1664 to take over, Stuyvesant had to surrender the city without firing a single shot. His own people basically just refused to fight for him.
So the English walk in. They keep the Dutch street names, they keep the pubs open, but they fundamentally change the economy in a truly devastating way. Under the Dutch, slavery existed in this loosely regulated, kind of legal gray zone, where there were actually some paths to freedom. But under the English, it was brutally codified into permanent, inherited law. The city basically began building its explosive prosperity on human trafficking. By 1703, an astounding 40% of New York households owned enslaved people. That was the highest proportion of any city in the American North.
Moving right along to Section 2, Rebellion and Revolution.
Decades of that brutal codification and the violent rebellions that followed, mixed with early civil liberty victories like the landmark trial of John Peter Zenger, really set the stage for a city that was eager to challenge any central authority. And man, the pace of the American Revolution here is just dizzying. In April 1776, George Washington arrives to hold the city. By July, the Declaration of Independence is read aloud, and this energized crowd literally tears down a gilded statue of King George and melts it down into 42,000 musket balls. But then reality hits hard. In August, the British attack with the largest force they had ever sent anywhere on Earth. Washington's army is completely crushed in Brooklyn, and they only survive because he pulls off this miraculous silent nighttime escape across the East River, totally hidden by a dense fog. By September, the city fell, and a massive fire completely wiped out a quarter of Manhattan.
Washington's own words really capture the absolute lowest point of that era. Watching his army collapse right before that miraculous escape, he stood on a hill and said, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." You can literally hear the despair. It marked the beginning of a truly chaotic low for New York as the British occupied the smoldering, half-burned city for 7 long years.
And to really wrap your head around the scale of the horror during this occupation, you just have to think about this number, 11,000. The British anchored these rotting prison ships just off the Brooklyn shore and crammed them with captured American soldiers and sailors. More Americans died in the horrific conditions on this specific ships than in all the battles of the Revolutionary War combined. It was just an unimaginable tragedy.
Which brings us to Section 3, the engine of empire.
Somehow, straight out of the literal ashes of war, the city rebuilt itself into an absolute economic titan. They used a brilliant grid plan in 1811 and then dug a massive ditch entirely across the state. In 1825, Governor DeWitt Clinton poured a barrel of Lake Erie water into the Atlantic Ocean to celebrate the opening of the Erie Canal. This 363-mile ditch dropped the cost of shipping goods from the American interior by an astonishing 90%, virtually overnight. New York always had the best natural harbor, but now it had an entire continent flowing its wealth directly out of its ports.
Because of this massive, unprecedented influx of trade, which, we should note, prominently included the immensely profitable Southern cotton industry, Wall Street underwent a profound transformation. It stopped being just an actual physical street, named after Peter Stuyvesant's old wooden defensive wall, and it evolved into a powerful, abstract concept. Wall Street essentially became the financial engine driving the entire national economy.
But as we know, explosive economic growth almost always fuels deep societal tensions. By 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War, New York was a literal powder keg. The spark was a military draft that allowed wealthy men to basically buy an exemption for $300. To put that into perspective, that was a sum a working-class immigrant couldn't even earn in a whole year. So the city erupted into the worst urban violence in American history. Mobs attacked the draft office and horrifyingly directed their rage at the black population. They even burned the colored orphan asylum to the ground, though thankfully the children narrowly escaped. At least 119 people were killed before troops coming straight from the battlefield at Gettysburg finally restored order.
That takes us to Section 4, Reaching for the Sky.
After the horror of those riots and the end of the Civil War, New York was once again resurrected. It enters the Gilded Age and starts expanding quite literally up into the sky. The sheer volume of human ambition driving this is just staggering. Over the next few decades, 12 million immigrants poured through the registry halls of Ellis Island. They arrived looking for a new life, and they physically built the marvels of modern New York with their bare hands. They laid the steel for the magnificent Brooklyn Bridge and walked the open iron beams to build the iconic Flatiron Building, fundamentally changing the city's skyline forever.
And right around this exact same era of massive demographic shift, Black Americans were fleeing the systemic terror of the Jim Crow South and heading north. They arrived in Upper Manhattan and created the Harlem Renaissance. No exaggeration here, this was the greatest explosion of Black art, literature, and music in American history. In just a few square miles during the 1920s, pioneers like Duke Ellington and Langston Hughes completely changed the rhythm of American culture.
But, of course, the Roaring Twenties hit a brutal, unforgiving wall. October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. The stock market collapsed and $14 billion were wiped out in a matter of hours. The city was instantly plunged into the Great Depression. Bread lines were literally forming on the exact same streets where Gilded Age banquets had taken place just a generation before. It was a total economic freefall.
And that freefall drops us right into Section 5, the brink of collapse.
From the depths of the 1930s, all the way into the gritty reality of the 1970s, the city wildly bounced between being the booming capital of the world and facing absolute bankruptcy. And you can't talk about this era without talking about infrastructure czar Robert Moses. He fundamentally reshaped the city for the modern automotive era. Step 1, he built these incredible parks, bridges, and highways. But step 2 came at a terrible cost. He displaced 250,000 New Yorkers, bulldozing right through vibrant, largely minority neighborhoods. Moses famously said he couldn't make an omelet without breaking eggs. But step 3 shows the ultimate result. Those broken communities accelerated a massive middle-class exodus out to the suburbs, totally draining the city of its tax base.
By 1975, the consequences were incredibly dire. The city was flat out of money. Firehouses were shuttered, garbage was literally piling up in the streets, and when the mayor went to Washington begging for a federal bailout, the president just said no. The Daily News captured the mood perfectly with this legendary, brutal headline, "Ford to City Drop Dead." Whole sections of the South Bronx were literally being abandoned and set on fire by landlords just to collect the insurance money. The city was burning.
Yet brilliantly illustrating our entire theme today, look at what happens in the midst of that total despair. In August 1973, inside a rec room at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the burning, abandoned South Bronx, an 18-year-old named DJ Koolherc threw a back-to-school party. By looping drum breaks between two turntables, he birthed hip-hop. The city's absolute greatest, most influential cultural export of the late 20th century was born directly out of the ashes of its darkest, most neglected neighborhood.
Which brings us to our final chapter, Section 6, Surviving the Chaos. Entering the modern era, you see that incredible compound momentum kick into overdrive yet again. The 1980s and early 90s brought the crack epidemic, which pushed violent crime to terrifying heights. Murders peaked at 2,262 in 1990 alone. The city once again looked like it was completely finished. But then, look at the massive drop by 1996. Murders plummeted to under 1,000. Violent crime fell dramatically across the board, Times Square totally transformed, and money poured right back in. The city roared back harder and faster than anyone ever thought possible.
And this brings us to the core of what you should really take away from this explainer today. In 2001, the city endured the unimaginable tragedy and terror of 9/11. Yet just like it did after the fires of the Revolution, the riots of the Civil War, and the bankruptcy of the 70s, it rebuilt. It kept moving forward. So looking at this long, incredibly tumultuous history, I want to leave you with one final question to think about. Does New York City survive in spite of its chaos, or is that very chaos the secret ingredient to its indestructible soul? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.